It's important for me to speak on this topic tonight of Unvanquished Angels, America's not-so-forgotten occult heroes, because one of the things that occurred to me as I was writing Occult America, and one of the things that surprised me, was the continually expanding circle of people I found in American history who were present at a kind of intersection between avant-garde spirituality and radical politics or political reform. And this intersection has been heavily forgotten, it's been heavily overlooked, and it still exists today. And I've often asked myself why it's not more evident to us, why it's not more apparent to us. And it seems to me that when modernist philosophy began to rise to a place of primacy in the Western cultural and political scene, it was largely materialist in nature. Now, what do I mean when I say modernist philosophy? I would describe the modernist idea, philosophically speaking, probably dating back to the time of Karl Marx in the mid-19th century, and punctuated by the principle that everything that exists around us has some unseen but detectable antecedent. For Marx, it was class conflict, which he felt would inevitably result in the dissolution of the capitalist industrial edifice and some sort of a worker-managed anarchistic state. For Louis Pasteur, who pioneered germ theory, it was, at least in matters of illness, the presence of germs, and that these invisible organisms were behind so much that for centuries was mysterious and devastating in illness. For Sigmund Freud, it was childhood trauma, which he felt somehow encoded us with our temperament, with our personality. For William James, the great philosopher and psychologist, it was the subliminal mind, or what we later came to call the subconscious mind. Even some occult figures themselves, like the great occult healer Franz Anton Mesmer, who was so influential first in Europe and later in America, wanted to distance themselves from the metaphysical. And Mesmer theorized, as he was proceeding about his work, particularly in Paris in the 1770s, that all of life was animated by this invisible ethereal fluid, which he called animal magnetism. And he disliked the idea of being associated with the spiritual or with the occult. He felt his ideas were very much in league with science. So it seemed to me that a materialist, modernist culture grew up in our midst and looked toward hidden causes as things that could be rearranged, that could be fixed, that could be perfected, and that could result in a better human life and a better human experience, and rejected the idea of mystery, sacred and cosmic causes and laws, rejected the idea that there was some hidden intelligence or hidden hand behind human events, but rather, as Darwin theorized, there was an orderly biological evolutionary pattern behind the development of life. And all of these things seemed to relegate the unseen, the mystical, the metaphysical to something that belonged to a past generation, or something that perhaps could be regarded as a source of mystery and artistic inspiration but not a central driving factor behind the reforms that were needed across Western life. I mean, that's the modernist point of view to some extent. But as with all things in human history, there are no straight lines. There are no straight lines. And there were not only tremendous overlaps in our country and in other nations between the occult and political reform, revolutionary politics, protest movements, but I think it would have been impossible for some of these movements to come into being as they did. Abolitionism, suffragism, socialism, and other movements that touch us today, had it not been for the occult impulse, very explicitly and very plainly, that drove the individual to assert a sense of greater, higher, radical personhood. And that played out with unique power in our own nation. And it's important that we understand it, because if we don't understand it, we don't understand ourselves. And we walk around with, I think, this false conception, which many people do, that somehow the occult or the mystical takes you away from concerns of real life, takes you away from hardcore issues of equity and fairness and political reform that we need in our world today. And I reject that notion. I reject that notion. And some of the heroes who I'll talk about tonight, I think will give you a sense of why. And I hope will almost give you a sense of who your own family is in a certain way, and give you a new sense of vigor and energy behind your own ethical and spiritual search and some of the political activities that might also be central to your life. To a very great extent, America has always been this massive contradiction in terms of the really coarse and nightmarish aspects of its history and its place almost continually as a laboratory of religious experiment. Going back to the experience of the American colonies in the 1600s, the colonies had a reputation very early on as a place of safe haven for religious radicals. Now, in the wake of all the occult religious experimentation that was going on in Europe in the 1400s, 1500s, particularly in the German-speaking part of Central Europe, there was a kind of reaction by the early 1600s against all of this. Queen Elizabeth had died. The Habsburg Empire was trying to reassert the power of the church and the papacy throughout Europe. And eventually these tensions spilled over into a conflict in 1618 that was known as the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War had many different causes and many different triggers, but basically, it pitted Catholic armies against Protestant armies in Central Europe, in between the Rhine Valley in the west and Bohemia and Prague in the east. And this was also the area where there was a great deal of occult experimentation going on in Europe. This was the place where you had experiments into alchemy and divination and number symbolism and the summoning of spirits and the creation of sigils. And it was just devastated by this generation-long war, and remained so probably for decades afterwards. And that is why you have a neighborhood called Germantown, for example, outside of Philadelphia. You had German-speaking immigrants making the trek across the Atlantic and settling Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and other areas. And one of these migrants was a figure named Johann Kelpius. Johann Kelpius, in the summer of 1693, made a trek out of the Rhine Valley area with about 40 pilgrims first to London and then eventually to the Philadelphia area. He was a kind of mystical monk. He existed on the fringes of the Lutheran Church, and he had a small group of followers who were interested in mysticism and prophecy and divination. And they were being continually harassed, and this area of Central Europe that had once been very fertile had been just laid waste by the 30 Years' War. And he and his circle of pilgrims made the trek across the Atlantic to this new city of Philadelphia, which was supposed to be the city of brotherly love. It was so founded by the Quaker William Penn, who had experienced discrimination as a Quaker at Oxford. He was part of a family of great wealth and means, and he was given a royal land grant. Of course, the state of Pennsylvania bears his family name. And his dream was to create a city where people of all different faiths could congregate without harassment. And hence, the city of Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, was his utopian experiment. And at the time, at the turn of the 1600s into the 1700s, it was a small place of probably about 500 houses. But amazingly, news of this place did trickle across the Atlantic, and Johann Kelpius came with his little band of followers, and they set up what was later called the Tabernacle in the Wilderness. They set up this little hermitage on the banks of the Wissahickon Creek in Philadelphia. And Kelpius only lived for about 12 more years. He eventually died, probably of tuberculosis. But again, it was amazing, because news spread of these occult monks hanging out in the wilderness, crafting astrology charts and using a telescope that they had brought with them from the old country. And it induced more and more migrants to come to the area. And for the next 2 or 3 generations, there were a great number of unusual religious groups that transplanted themselves to the American colonies, one of which was the Shaker movement, led by a woman named Ann Lee. They were Quakers. They were based in the city of Manchester, where they were known as the Shaking Quakers, because they used to go into these spirit trances, and they used to conduct seances, and they would shake with the passion of the spirits that were occupying them. They would create these beautiful works of art, tapestries and songs and poetry that they said came from them by way of channeled psychic messages from the spirit world. And they were accused of witchcraft, and they were harassed. So eventually, Mother Ann and a band of about 12 disciples came to New York City in 1775. They worked menial jobs in New York City, cleaning out chamber pots and things like that, chimney sweeping. And they scraped together enough money so that the next year, 1776, they were able to cobble together enough money to buy a little patch of land in the village of Niskayuna, which is outside of Albany, New York. And they established at Niskayuna the first Shaker village. And if you go there today, there are not only remnants of the village, but you can see Mother Ann's grave right there on the property. And New York State, in its infinite wisdom, decided to erect and then abandon a state-run mental asylum right next to the Shaker village. You can also break into the abandoned asylum, as I did, and a guy with a hockey mask will chase you down the corridor with a knife. It's very frightening. I don't recommend it. I did go inside that asylum. It's incredibly frightening. Don't do that. But you can go up there and you can see Mother Ann's grave. And concurrent to the establishment of this commune in upstate New York, which spread as far north as Maine and as far south as Kentucky. The Shaker movement spread out and had different communes covering a great deal of the nation for a while. Concurrent with that, there was a kind of a sweep of religious ferment that was passing through the United States at that time that was called the Great Awakening. It was kind of a Baptist revival movement. And when these sweeps of religious revivals would occur in the United States back in its agrarian days, you never knew what was really going to come out of it. People would go into trance states, they would claim visitations by angels, they would claim all kinds of metaphysical and mystical experiences. And this happened to a young woman in 1775 named Jemima Wilkinson, who lived in Providence, Rhode Island. And Jemima, too, was part of a reasonably well-off Quaker family. And she was very caught up in the religious revival movement called the Great Awakening. And she also was stricken with tuberculosis, which was also traveling through the New England states at the time. And one day in October of 1775, Jemima went to her bed really sick with tuberculosis and almost in a comatose state. And she was slipping in and out of fever dreams and mumbling and describing visions. And there was a vigil by her deathbed. Her family was certain that this was the end for her. And to their absolute astonishment, after several days of being in this sweat-drenched, feverish dream state, she sprung up from her bed, all red and ruddy with life, and she said to her astonished Quaker household, "The girl that you knew as Jemima is dead. She has gone off to the spirit world. I am a messenger of the divine spirit who now will only answer to the name Public Universal Friend." And with that, she anointed herself a kind of spiritual messenger. And that Sunday, she went to a local churchyard and outside the church began to deliver a homily under a tree nearby. And the local people were absolutely astonished. And I want you to listen to this very carefully, because this was the first time that any of them had ever witnessed a woman speaking in public. It was completely unheard of. The two first recognized female religious figures in America were Mother Ann Lee, the leader of the Shaker movement, and the Public Universal Friend, Jemima Wilkinson. Now, Jemima and her followers actually became among the first white settlers of central New York State. And they weren't messing around. They founded a town called Jerusalem in central New York State because they felt, hey, look, Jemima really is coming from the beyond to give a second dispensation to humanity. And they built her a mansion in the town of Jerusalem, which still stands today. And this was in the early 1800s. And if you go up to that region of central New York today, there's a little town outside of Jerusalem called Penyan. To this very day, her presence, her memory still divides people. Was she a fake? Was she real? Was she not? And there are all these stories about Jemima that circulate as folklore in central New York today. This is one of them. She used to ride around in this carriage, which still exists, which had the letters U and F on it for Universal Friend. And according to folklore, it may be true, although everybody always places it at different bodies of water. According to local folklore, Jemima stood at sort of a creek that runs across Main Street in Penn Yan, New York, and she declared to her followers and to other folk in the town that one Sunday morning she was going to walk on water. So everybody gathered to see, the universal friend walk on water. And she got out of her carriage and she gave a sermon, and she began to sort of whip up the crowd into kind of a frenzy. And she said, "Now I ask you, do ye believe that I can do this thing?" And the crowd shouted, "Yes." And she said, "Well, if you believe I can do it, then there's no need for any vulgar outer display," and got in her carriage and rode off. Now, I really don't know whether that story is true, but that story is still repeated in the town of Penn Yan today. And I was told that as late as the 1950s, you could get into like a physical altercation if you were around the wrong people and said something insulting about the universal friend. But the point is, these kinds of figures literally provided the first opening for women as recognized religious leaders in the New World. And their religious leadership came about through an assertion of the individual search for meaning, a spirituality that can rightly and must be called occult because it existed as a product of mystical forces outside the parameters of mainstream religion. It was somebody completely asserting that they had a direct experience with invisible forces that had absolutely no approbation whatsoever from any recognized church or congregation. It was completely free. And it opened up a political door that had never been there before. And this was happening in pockets throughout the nation. One of the things I was talking about earlier today in the library, we had a great group from Atlas Obscura, a couple of whom are here tonight. I was talking about the presence and the influence of Freemasonry in early American life. And without question, it was a real and authentic influence. As I was saying earlier, a number of the founders, in fact, were Freemasons, among them George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, John Hancock. And within Masonry, you had this esoteric spiritual vision that the mystery schools and the symbols of the ancients represented a gateway to the invisible, a gateway to the mystical, a gateway to the highest expression of self, and it was the property of no individual religion. It was a very, very radical point of view, and it remains so. It remains so. To this day, the fissures between the church, the Catholic Church, and Freemasonry are completely unhealed, completely unhealed. As late as the 1980s, figures in the church, including Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict, issued papers saying that a Catholic cannot be a Freemason. This is very much a live fissure. So within Masonry, you had this radical idea that the symbols of the mythical world, skulls, obelisks, all-seeing eyes, pyramids, were gateways to something greater, and that people could belong to this group, search for their own conception of meaning without any oversight to or tutelage to any religious order. It was extremely radical. And from this ferment grew a Masonic tradition known as Prince Hall Masonry, which is an African-American Masonic order, which ran parallel to what is called free and accepted Masonry, ran parallel to traditional Masonry, but today, traditional Masonry and Prince Hall Masonry are growing much, much closer. And I actually think in our generation, those two orders are going to merge. What's interesting about Prince Hall Masonry is that its founder, whose name was Prince Hall, its founder was a freed man of color who lived in Boston, and he was a leather worker by trade. And the history of Prince Hall Masonry has been misunderstood until very, very recently. According to the traditional telling, and I probably have repeated this telling on this very stage because it's only going back now about 3 years that our understanding has expanded, and I'll be more specific about that. But according to the traditional telling, there was a British army garrison stationed outside of Boston in 1775, and Prince Hall and some of his associates asked them for a charter to form a Masonic lodge, and that this British army garrison, which had within it its own Freemasonic lodge, granted them a charter, and Prince Hall founded what was then known as African Lodge Number 1. Now, there is truth to that account, but the date is incorrect. For many, many, many years, the date that's been given is 1775. In fact, there are two historians, John Hairston and Oscar Allende, who discovered through rigorous research primary documents that demonstrate that Prince Hall Masonry was actually founded 3 years later in 1778. And it probably wasn't a British army garrison that gave them their charter. It was kind of this renegade Masonic figure. And it's important because these dates are really tough to track sometimes. The Massachusetts Historical Society basically made a historical error back in the 1790s and stated in its paperwork that Prince Hall's movement was founded in 1775. And you would think a source going back to the same century, to the same generation, would be correct. But the source was wrong. The first meeting notes were in 1778. This may sound very inside baseball and very incidental and beside the point, but I've spoken at Freemasonic lodges where people get very worked up about this. And there was one man in particular who was arguing back and forth with me. And I was explaining to him that these two historians had done just incredible work uncovering primary documents in the African American Masonic tradition, and he didn't want to listen to this because he was attached to the old dates, and he tried to pull rank on me and said, "Listen, I'm a Grand Master, buddy." And I don't recall what I said, but I probably said something to the effect of, "I'm a historian," and didn't go well. But the fact is, John and Oscar deserve to be recognized for their work, and I never miss an opportunity to extol the value of it. But the reason I'm telling you this story is this. One of the other facts in the life of Prince Hall, and eventually African Lodge Number 1 came to bear his name, which is why we refer to it today as Prince Hall Masonry. One of the interesting facts about his life is this. His signature was affixed to some of the first petitions in American life to endorse abolitionism, to oppose slavery. First in 1777, and again in 1778. And I want to say this very, very carefully, because it's important that this be understood. The first black-led abolitionist movement in the American colonies was Freemasonic in nature. I'm not saying that abolitionism grew out of Freemasonry. There were many forces behind abolitionism. Quaker ethics, the ideals coming from the Enlightenment, anybody working with ideas of the value and the primacy of the individual, anybody who wanted to see the verbiage of the Declaration of Independence actually translate into something meaningful and actionable and real had to, by nature, be an abolitionist. But the first black-led abolitionist movement in this nation was Prince Hall Masonry. And again, it coincided with this search for meaning, this search for the mystical innards of life that couldn't be contained by any dogma, doctrine, or movement. And this march continued across American life. And one of the areas in which it is most severely misunderstood, one of the areas in which we are just complete amnesiacs to our own history, is the manner in which the suffragist movement grew hand in hand with the occult movement called spiritualism, or talking to the dead. And I cannot emphasize this plainly enough or clearly enough, because the emergence of these two movements, it was not incidental and it was not coincidental. They were, I hesitate even to say sister movements, because I think that that puts it at too much a distance. They were organically part of the same whole, and I'll explain what I'm driving at. The movement that we call spiritualism, or talking to the dead, in which Americans formed seance circles and sat around tables in darkened parlors and tried to contact the spirits that populate the other world, that movement as a properly named social force really began in the winter of 1848. In upstate New York, central New York State, the area that Jemima Wilkinson, the universal friend, and her followers had settled, this vast stretch of land running through central New York State, called the Burned Over District, said to be burned over by the fires of the spirit. Outside the city of Rochester in central New York was a little town called Hydesville, and there was a Methodist family, the Fox family, that lived there with its 3 daughters. And 2 of the young adolescent daughters, Kate and Margaret, told their shocked parents that the bangs and raps and crashes that were being heard in the little family cabin were spirit raps, and that the girls had worked out a system to communicate with spirits from the other world. And people descended upon this cabin to test their claims: journalists, editors, scientists, clergy, and many of them came away saying, "My God, we have investigated it, and Kate and Margaret Fox seem to be telling the truth. These 2 teenage girls have worked out a method of spirit raps for communicating with the other world." And people were absolutely enthralled with this. Americans from all over the country read about this in newspapers and were enthralled. And it's interesting to ask why. Why it wasn't the first instance of supernatural activity that had occurred and been talked about in the colonies. There were people here and there that had claimed such experiences, some of whom had gained fame. It wasn't that the Fox sisters were the first, but they really broke through. And I asked myself why. And I think, first of all, one of the reasons that the Fox sisters broke through is because they appealed to that finest instinct in American life, in which people wanted to take a do-it-yourself approach to everything, including to the mystical, including to the unseen. There was this feeling that if these 2 young kids could work out a spirit rap system, then these spiritual possibilities were open to everybody, and that the age of prophecy didn't just belong to the biblical era, but it could be experienced right here, right now, in a log cabin, in central New York State, by a 12 and 14-year-old girl. So doesn't that mean I could do it? Doesn't that mean everybody could do it? And this is so important, this movement that the Fox sisters founded was uniquely appealing to women, because it was this 2 teenage girls. And suddenly, and they had judges and politicians and journalists and scientists, clergy coming to the cabin and sort of sitting enthralled as if they were in the company of Cleopatra. And in a certain way they were. In a certain way they were. And if a woman could sit at the head of a seance table while everyone joined hands and she summoned spirit raps, that was a way of gaining a voice in the spiritual and intellectual culture. These figures were written about in newspapers and books. Spiritualist societies formed, which started their own newspapers and newsletters. Spiritualist clubs. There was a medium named Andrew Jackson Davis who lived in the Hudson Valley district of New York, a little ways south of the burned over district. He lived in the city of Poughkeepsie, and in the press he was jokingly referred to as the Poughkeepsie Seer, and it was meant to make fun of him, but he liked it and he embraced the title. And when he was about 17, in the year 1845, he began to gain national notice. He would go into these trance states and come out and dictate lectures and so on. And shortly after the advent of the Fox sisters, Davis wrote a book in 1851 called Discourse on Spiritual Intercourse. And yes, who's 12 years old? It's a funny title, I know. I like it too, right? I laugh every time I say it. I feel like Beavis and Butthead. And in Discourse on Spiritual Intercourse, Davis commissioned illustrations that gave Americans the blueprint for the very first time on how to organize their own seance at home, around any old kitchen table. And if you go online and you look up that book, and you can find it, I think, you'll check out the illustrations, and they're a trip, because you see all these people in this early Victorian garb, seated around seance tables, and it's the classic image that we have of the seance, which is French for sitting, although there's no exact translation, but it's what Mesmer, the occult healer, used to call his gatherings. He referred to them as seances. So in 1851, that term entered the American lexicon, and the combination of the Fox sisters and Andrew Jackson Davis, the Poughkeepsie Seer, again, this really turned people on, because he was a poor kid from a farm. He had been a cobbler's apprentice. That didn't detract from his credibility, it built his credibility, because people were very turned on. Again, the idea was this kind of low-born kid from the Hudson Valley, who people made fun of as the Poughkeepsie Seer, he's acting as a prophet. So why can't I do that? Why can't I do that too? So here you have this extraordinary summoning, possibility, opening to everyday people, that they can contact lost loved ones, that they can communicate with beings in the heavens. And as my friend Michael Gomes, a great historian, likes to joke, it turns out that the spirits were progressive. The messages from the spirit world were quite progressive. Andrew Jackson Davis would go into these trance states, and he would visit heaven, and then he would come out of his trance and come back to our earthly realm, and he would say, heaven is, which he called Summerland, which is a term I always use now. Instead of someone dying, I say, they're going to Summerland. And everybody always looks at me funny. That's what I mean, in case I say that to you. And he referred to heaven as Summerland, and he said it was populated by blacks and whites and Native Americans and Jews and Catholics. All the bad people are there. And it was amazing, because this was reported in the press. And of course, you have to remember that at this time, dominant religion in America was Calvinist Protestantism. And unless you were saved, you were going to hell. But he would talk about meeting Indian tribes and different religious observers from faraway places, Hindus, Buddhists, Mohammedans, as the phrase went at the time. So he was blowing apart this idea that the afterlife was only a place for people who adhered to one religious order. So without announcing himself, as any kind of a radical or reformer. His point of view was shattering the old order, Meanwhile, and this is no coincidence, the same year that the Fox sisters introduced America to the spirit world, about 6 months later, maybe 50 miles down the road east, was held the first Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights. Right there in the burned over district. Right there in the same place that had been settled by the Public Universal Friends followers, the same place where the Rochester rappings occurred. And I'm only scratching the surface. There were all kinds of new religious movements growing up along the road, now called Route 20, that cuts through the burned over district, including Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventism, different experiments in utopianism and biblical communism. But we only have one night together, so I'm limiting myself. But it was a fact that for about one generation in the second half of the 19th century, virtually every suffragist, every prominent suffragist, had spent some time at the seance table. And virtually every spirit medium, most of whom, the overwhelming majority of which were women, were involved in the suffragist movement. These two movements were completely joined because spiritualism, in addition to whatever its occult properties were, burst open the door and gave women their first recognized voice in the civic and religious culture. It was absolutely revolutionary. And the primary names in the suffragist movement not only were aware of this, but it was second nature to them. Susan B. Anthony used to have a fear of speaking in public, a fear of speaking on stage. She wrote a letter in the early 1850s to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she said to her in this letter, "Oh, how I wish I could be a spirit medium for just 2 weeks." And she was being absolutely serious because she and others in the movement, they looked up to spirit mediums as women who were capable of addressing audiences, speaking to crowds. And although Susan B. Anthony ended her life as an agnostic or an atheist, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was not only, whoa, I love when I talk about spiritualism and weird things happen. Good. You didn't do it, Wes, did you? See? It's all true. I hope our digital folk can still see. Anyway, I'm glad it happened. See, you cynics. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton had a lifelong interest in spiritualism, and later on in mind metaphysics, or what we later came to call the power of positive thinking, or referred to today as the secret or the law of attraction. And it's funny, I was doing an interview about this with Big Think, and it was up on YouTube, and they put some sort of a lurid headline on it, saying something like, "Liberalism and feminism were born of the occult." I didn't exactly say that, but I do make my case in the video, much as I'm describing it to you all right now. And somebody in the comment section wrote something to the effect of, "Well, I was a women's studies minor at Yale, and I never learned any of this stuff," as to say, this can't be true. And my reaction is, then I'd like to talk to your teachers, because they owe you a refund. They did a really, really bad job. If this isn't part of the history of the women's rights movement, then it's like cutting an artery out of that history. You just cannot understand it without realizing that there was this complete organic co-growth between suffragism and spiritualism. The two were almost like a strand of DNA, and this went on for about 2 generations in the 1800s. I don't know that suffragism as a political movement would have grown, and grown quickly and strongly, had it not been for the advent of spiritualism. Obviously it would have happened, but I think it would have happened probably a couple of decades later, and I think it would have been a lot harder for the movement's leaders to have emerged, because these leaders, this is going to sound like an exaggeration, but I'm not being glib, these leaders, to a very significant extent, emerged from the seance table. Andrew Jackson Davis, the Poughkeepsie seer, who I mentioned earlier, was married to a suffragist named Mary Fenn Love. Mary Fenn Love. And in the early 1850s, she made the remark, the era of spiritualism has inaugurated the era of woman. The era of spiritualism has inaugurated the era of woman. That is not an exaggeration. That is not an exaggeration. But why don't we know? Why are kids not learning this? Why are we anesthetized to our own history, in effect? I want people to know this history, not because I'm sticking up for my team, although I'm human and there's probably some of that in my outlook and in my approach. But I want them to know it because I want people to have a concept of their own individual largeness. I want people to understand the epic possibilities that are open to them as individuals. I mean, imagine the experience of somebody who elicits spirit raps at the seance table in one year, and in the next year is being invited to address a political convention. It's absolutely extraordinary. And the opening that spiritualism created cannot be overstated. The first female candidate for president in the United States was a woman named Victoria Woodhull, who herself was a lifelong spirit medium. She was nominated for the presidency in 1872 by a protest party called the Equal Rights Party. She rose to national prominence because she was a spirit medium and she was also a passionate and eloquent advocate for suffragism. And in 1871, Victoria Woodhull became the first woman to address a joint session of Congress. She addressed a joint meeting of both the Senate and the House Judiciary Committee. And she gave an impassioned talk calling for equal voting rights. And this talk was known as the Woodhull Memorial, the Woodhull Memorial. It stands up really well as a really elegant piece of American oration. She sounds almost like Thomas Paine. She's very persuasive, very convincing. And if you look up the Woodhull Memorial later tonight, you can read it. You can find it on your phone. And after the speech, because again, reporters were sort of astonished that a woman could deliver such an impassioned and elegant piece of public oration, reporters asked her where her inspiration came from, obviously thinking that she was going to say, oh, my hubby wrote it for me, or something like that. And she said, with a completely straight and commanding demeanor to reporters, that the speech was dictated to her in a dream by this ghostly Greek figure wearing a robe who had been her spirit guide ever since she had been a little girl. And this was reported in the newspapers. She had no embarrassment about this whatsoever. She rose to national prominence, and so she was named by the Equal Rights Party as their presidential candidate. I don't know, frankly, that she ever appeared on a single state ballot. It was a protest candidacy. And in all fairness, Victoria could be kind of slippery. She named the abolitionist hero Frederick Douglass as her running mate. And when reporters asked Douglass about this, he said to them, I never heard of any of this. And he was completely sort of nonplussed and what? And that was also a part of Victoria's character. But that brings up the name Frederick Douglass. And this is such an important piece of history in connection with Douglass. I feel privileged to be able to share it with you. And I write about it in Occult America. So if there's anything I say that you want to double check, or if there's any of the sources that you want to check, and I urge you to hold my feet to the fire in terms of sources, you can find it all in Occult America. And this was, for me, I would say, the most lasting personal discovery that I experienced while I was writing that book. And it's a very important story for me to tell. By the way, Wes, what happened with the lights? Was it the spirit or blown circuit? The spirits. Okay. Wes says it was the spirits. Yeah. No. Douglass is obviously famous around the world, not only as an abolitionist hero, but for his memoirs of life in slavery. He wrote 3 memoirs, and all 3 are worth reading. There is some repetition, inevitably, when a person writes 3 memoirs, but all 3 bring new insights and new examples to bear on the nature of Douglass's life. And there is a story that he tells, a really seminal, central story in his life. In fact, I think it's probably the pivot point of his entire life, that is occult in nature and has been, at least in the past, completely overlooked by historians. And I say completely because this story is now coming to be recognized, and I'm pleased to see that it's getting cited in papers and at conferences. And it's important because without understanding this story, we have a truly incomplete portrait of probably the single greatest voice in abolitionism in American history. And the story is this. Some of you certainly know this, but the occult component of it is largely unknown. Douglass was obviously born into slavery, and when he was a teenager in the 1830s, he was brought to a household in the city of Baltimore. And city life, as he wrote, was a little bit better than country life. The brutality was there, the hunger was there, the separation from his family and from his birth mother was there, the humiliation was there, but there were certain aspects of city life that alleviated some of that. The head of his household, the mistress head of his household, began teaching him to read until the master of the household found out, and he forbade it in the grossest terms possible. But Frederick was able to gain some rudimentary grasp of reading, of literacy, and because he was in a city, he was able to find discarded newspapers and things from time to time that he could use to practice his reading and build up his literary skills. It was important. But the family returned to the countryside when Frederick was about 15 years old. And the master of the household, as Frederick records it, was concerned that a young slave who had tasted city life would no longer prove obedient. So he handed Frederick, at the age of 15, over to this incredibly cruel figure named Edward Covey, who was known as a breaker of slaves. And Covey was considered, even by the standards of the day, this was in 1836, to be brutal, heartless, sadistic, cruel. And Covey was very proud of his reputation as a breaker of slaves. And he would beat Frederick, this young teenager, mercilessly. And one night, Frederick was so desperate that he ran away, and he found his way back to the home of his former master, and he begged him to take him back in. He was caked with blood. He was obviously traumatized, and the man just refused. And he said, in the morning you need to go right back to Covey's farm. And Frederick did go. And there were other episodes of beatings, torment. One of the things that struck me when I was reading Frederick's memoirs is how one-dimensional our view of history can get. We think we know people, we think we know circumstances, but anybody who could read Frederick Douglass's memoirs and doesn't fall to his or her knees, almost literally, just isn't a full person. To read of the humiliations that he went through and to read about them at a time when life in general was more brutal. But he captures the deprivations and the trauma, I think, as no one else ever has or been able to. So the beatings and the torment continued, and one day, Frederick ran away again. Now I want to be very clear about what I'm telling you. Everything that I'm describing to you is directly from Frederick's own hands, written in all 3 of his memoirs. And you're going to ask yourself, as you should ask yourself, why isn't this part of the fabric of our history? Why aren't kids learning about this? It's hidden in plain sight. Part of the reason is because the profession of historians has produced a lot of gifted and talented people, but it hasn't necessarily produced well-rounded people. And sometimes historians are so ignorant and so closed-eyed to occult and mystical experience that they're unable to understand or read into things, even when they're presented directly to them. Or they find such things boring and illegitimate, and they skip right past them. It's usually one or the other, but that's changing. So Frederick writes that one night at the age of 15, he runs away again from Edward Covey's farm, and he's hiding in the woods, and he's shivering, and he's afraid, and he's crying, and he has no idea what to do. And he says that a man found him, who he describes as an old African medicine man named Sandy Jenkins. And Sandy found Frederick, and he took him to his cabin, and he cleaned him up. Now, Sandy being identified as an old African medicine man means, in the parlance of that day, that he was a root worker, that he was involved with the African American magical tradition known as hoodoo. Not voodoo, the Afro-Caribbean tradition, but hoodoo. Hoodoo. Hoodoo is a still existing and still practiced African American based occult religious system that draws upon some retention of traditional religious ideas and spell work from Central and West Africa, particularly of the Yoruba people who occupied the territory that we today call Nigeria. And hoodoo was also a syncretic religious system that drew upon aspects of Kabbalah and German American folklore and Catholicism. You know, we ask ourselves, well, how did people have access to this? People had access to a lot. It was really quite surprising, the different things that people could absorb. For example, the Yoruban god of thunder and rain is named Chango. And the traditional statues of Chango that you'll find in West and Central Africa depict him with an axe. And he uses the axe to cut up clouds and cause rain to fall. And there was an American folklorist traveling in the South in about 1900 who was tracking the beliefs of different practitioners of hoodoo. And he remembered and he recalled seeing a African American woman doing a ritual outside her house where she carried a hatchet and she was waving it in the air. And he later felt, after talking to her, that she was practicing this retained ritual that was associated with Chango. That's part of hoodoo tradition. Now here's a funny story. Years ago, I was at some family event, and people were worried that it was going to rain. It was in a backyard somewhere. And one of the older women at the event, to keep it from raining, stuck a knife in the ground. And it was her family tradition. She came from a Jewish family. It was her family tradition that if you stick a knife in the ground, you can stave off the rain. I am all but certain that that family tradition of hers was probably something that was an adaptation from hoodoo, an adaptation of what this woman was doing with the axe, which came from West and Central African traditions. These things really travel. Religious history is a total mosaic. It's completely syncretic. There are no straight lines in it. There are no borders. It's totally permeable. And this is especially true of the occult. So, Sandy was also known as a root worker, which was a very common term and a term that remains in use today in the 21st century for somebody who was a hoodoo doctor, or, as Frederick wrote, a venerated African medicine man. So Sandy takes Frederick to his cabin, bathes him, cleans him up, and he says to him, "Listen, you are going to have to go back to Covey." And Frederick says, "I can't do that." And Sandy says, "You have to listen to me. If you don't go back to Covey, you're going to be killed. You're going to have no choice. But I'm going to give you something that's going to help you." And Sandy goes and gives Frederick what Frederick refers to in his memoirs as a magic root, a magic root. It was a small, spherical, hardened nub, which Frederick doesn't name. But based on the physical description, I am absolutely certain that it was something that we would call jalap root, which dries into a hard spherical nub, which was widely known throughout the South at that time, and which was referred to in hoodoo tradition as John the Conqueror, John the Conqueror, John the Conqueror. It was considered to be, and it still is, a magical object that would give you strength, that would give you power, that would give you sexual virility, particularly for a man. Like attracts like is a sort of universal law in the occult, and it may be that one of the reasons that jalap root, which was known as John the Conqueror or John the Conqueror, one of the reasons that it may have become associated with strength and virility is because in its dried state, it dries to a very hard spherical nub, and it sort of represents a male testicle. It seems in a tactile way, and even physically, by look, like a male testicle. And so he gave what Frederick referred to as this magic root to him. And Frederick said, armed with my magic root in my pocket and terrified, I went back to the farm. And he enters the property, he runs into Covey, and he writes, "Covey was downright polite to me. He was actually nice to me." And he says, "I'm not superstitious, but I started thinking that maybe there was something in this root that Sandy gave me." But it turns out it was Sunday. And that was Covey's day of rest. And Monday morning, Frederick realized that Covey was a Sunday Christian. And come Monday, he was back to his old, horrific self. And Frederick said he grabbed him and he dragged him into the barn, and he was preparing to give him a terrible, terrible beating. But Frederick said, at that moment, and he wrote this, "From where came the strength, I do not know. I stood up to Covey. I stood up to him, and I fought back." And the two of them struggled for 2 hours, and Covey could not get the better of him. And after 2 hours, Covey desisted, and he never physically challenged him again. Frederick remained in slavery, but he said, at that moment, I experienced this inner awakening, and I knew that although I was a slave still in physical form, I could never again be a slave in fact, and I would escape physically at the first possible moment. And he did, and within about 2 years, he did escape, and he made his way north and began to build his career as an abolitionist. Now, Covey was probably embarrassed by the fact that he could not get the better of this 15-year-old kid, and he didn't want it made known. So he backed off and he never bothered Frederick again. And Frederick wrote, could it have been the magic root, John the Conqueror root, Jalep root, that Sandy gave me that produced that sense of courage in me, that permitted me to stand up, and that actually gave me the means to stand up successfully? And he said, I was never really sure. Maybe the root just gave me confidence, or maybe a shadow of the beliefs of this wise African medicine man had rubbed off on me. Frederick writes this in all 3 of his memoirs, and yet you say the word hoodoo, and most people look at you blankly. You talk about this occult experience in the life of Frederick Douglass, and most people say, who made that up? And it's right there. And it's right there. And believe me, Frederick Douglass was very concerned with people being educated. He didn't want kind of backwards beliefs to be impinging upon people's sense of progress and possibility and so on. So it was a very delicate act for him to share this story. And you can read whole biographies of Frederick Douglass, whole stories of the abolitionist movement, and this is nowhere to be seen. Because as I was saying earlier, most people who are trained as historians don't have the first idea or the first interest in the occult. So the fact is, it's such a seminal part of our history, but Sandy Jenkins gives them this magic root, and already somebody's turning pages. They're not looking at it. They're not paying attention to it. That is hoodoo tradition. Hoodoo, again, not voodoo, the Afro-Caribbean faith, but hoodoo, the African-American faith. Hoodoo played a pivotal role in one of the most important liberation stories in American history. I must add a personal note to this. Because I feel that although Frederick Douglass obviously wrote for people in a certain time and in a certain place, you must be able to find universally applicable lessons in the lives of your heroes, in the lives of people you love. And if you take a personal lesson from the life of Frederick Douglass, let it be this. You must not have tolerance. You must not have tolerance for being in proximity to cruel people, even if you can't get away from those people right away. Frederick could not get away from Covey right away. He was very clear about this. He said, after I stood up to this man, I remained a slave, but I vowed that I would be free in my interior, and I would just wait for the moment where I could be free as a physical fact. And I would say to you, if there are people in your life who are tormenting you, who are running you down in these bullying and humiliating ways, you may say to yourself, I can't get away from them. They're my boss, or they're my in-laws, or they're this person, that person. I'm tied down. So was Frederick, in the most brutal of ways. So was Frederick. But he did stand up, and he did make a vow that he would be free as an interior fact from Edward Covey, and he would watch and wait for the very moment where he could be free as an exterior fact. Maybe you should get yourself a John the Conqueror root. I say that with total seriousness. If Frederick Douglass wrote about it in 3 memoirs, maybe you should try it. Go to luckymojo.com. I have no ties to that company, by the way. I'm not advertising anything. They just happen to be an ethical company run by Cat Ironwood. They're a wonderful, ethical hoodoo house. You can buy a John the Conqueror root. I don't know, costs $7. Why don't you carry it in your pocket and see what happens? Do it on Thanksgiving. These are some of my occult heroes, but they're not thought of as occult, are they? Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we don't think of them in those terms. One of the great voices of protest in the early 20th century was Marcus Garvey, the pioneering black nationalist figure. Again, no one would think of Marcus Garvey as an occult figure. Marcus Garvey is thought of as a thundering political presence. He's thought of as somebody who extolled black ownership, black personhood, was later targeted and brought down by the FBI in a series of politically motivated lawsuits. But one of the things I discovered as I was looking into Marcus's life is that his letters, his articles, his speeches are completely imbued with this language that was associated with the early New Thought movement, the mind metaphysics movement. The idea that if you use your mind in the right way, you can reshape and reorder outward circumstances. And one time, Marcus was giving a speech in Kingston, and he said, the primary difference between the white man and the black man is that the white man lives by science. You must get yourself a scientific view of God. And people could wonder, what was he getting at? What was he driving at? What was this reference to science? Well, the fact is, in the West Indies, science was sometimes used as a slang term for the occult. And here in America, there was religious science, divine science, Christian science, all these mind metaphysics movements, which implied that you could use your mind to actually concretize and produce outer events in the world. And Marcus Garvey's speeches and newspapers were completely imbued with this mind metaphysics outlook. He believed in a total marriage of material political movements and the right uses of the mind that could concretize outer events. He never really came right out and announced his allegiances, but again, if you take an interest in occult subject matters, the terms that he would use are spotlights that show exactly where he was coming from. There were a great many figures as the 20th century opened who functioned in this way. Another one was Wallace D. Wattles, the success writer who wrote a book called The Science of Getting Rich, which I'm sure some of you have read. This book was written in 1910. It shot up to popularity again in the year 2007 because it was revealed as a key source behind Rhonda Byrne's book and movie The Secret. Wallace D. Wattles was also a socialist activist and candidate. He ran for Congress on the Socialist Party ticket. He ran for mayor of Elwood, Indiana, his hometown, on the Socialist Party ticket, came in a close second. And he was preparing another mayoral run when he died of tuberculosis in the year 1911. But if you read The Science of Getting Rich carefully, and if you know your Marx, you will see language that Wallace uses that unmistakably links the book to Marxism. He talks about how the titans of industry, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, were necessary agents of economic development, but their historical purpose has been served, and soon they and their presence and the edifice that supports them will wither away, and each individual, through the power and the strength and the mental causation of his or her own thoughts, will come into wealth, happiness, self-sufficiency. And the workers will elect their own to hold public office. And through purchasing of stock, they'll own businesses and department stores and create cooperative industries and enterprises. This runs throughout The Science of Getting Rich. I wrote an article about it at medium.com called Karl Marx Prosperity Coach. I encourage you to read it. It's absolutely fascinating that this book, which I republished in 2007, and the edition that I published went to #1 on the Bloomberg Businessweek bestseller list. It's a marriage of mind mysticism and Marxism, an absolute marriage. And I encourage you to read it that way. And I'm going to wrap up soon because we could sort of go on all night, but I want to just give you a flavor of the family tree that has existed of these unheralded, unknown occult figures who were vital agents of change and reform in American culture. Henry Wallace was the second vice president to Franklin Roosevelt. He preceded Harry Truman, who obviously is known to history. But Wallace had been a vital and influential force in the White House throughout the 1930s. He was also Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture, and he was responsible, his farming policies were responsible for saving thousands of family farms during the Great Depression. He was also a seeker in the occult and mysticism. He was a member of the Theosophical Society. He was a devotee of astrology and Buddhism, believed in reincarnation. And he is the man responsible for the mysterious symbol of the eye and pyramid appearing on the back of our dollar bill. That wonderful, beautiful, alluring symbol is surrounded by the Latin maxim, annuit septus novos ordo seclorum, which can be loosely translated as God smiles on our new order of the ages. It was designed by Freemasons in the Continental Congress starting on July 4th, 1776, and although it's not a symbol directly taken from Masonry, it's Masonic philosophy to the absolute core, This idea that the new republic was one of a link in a chain of great civilizations extending back to ancient Babylon and ancient Egypt that extolled the search for meaning. And the eye with the pyramid hovering above it is a sign that material progress can never be complete without the eye of providence, without the insight of the spiritual. And Wallace, who was a Freemason, as was Franklin Roosevelt, had a tremendous affinity for occult imagery. Remember, we were talking earlier about the fact that Freemasonry is a religious order that, I won't say a religious order, no, a spiritual order that believes that symbolism is the gateway to higher understanding. And Wallace thought this great, beautiful symbol, the reverse of the Great Seal of America, needs to be brought back to the public eye. It will serve a moralizing function as America tries to lift itself out of the Great Depression. So in 1934, Wallace approached his boss, Franklin Roosevelt, and said, we must bring this symbol back to the attention of the public. And he suggested to Roosevelt that they use the symbol to mint some sort of a new commemorative coin. And Roosevelt, himself a Freemason, with a taste for esoteric imagery, said, no, I have a better idea. We're going to place this symbol on the back of the dollar bill. Can you imagine that this was possible in those days? You know, today we can't even replace Andrew Jackson with Harriet Tubman. You issue a Sacagawea coin and it, shuts down the country. But here was this decision made to place this beautiful esoteric symbol on the back of the dollar bill. And Franklin Roosevelt in 1935 personally supervised the placement of this symbol on the bill so that, and this is very interesting, and keep this in mind next time you pull a dollar bill out of your wallet. We have records that still exist in the U.S. Treasury Department archives that show in pencil, in Franklin Roosevelt's own handwriting, he supervised the placement of the eye and the pyramid on the back of the dollar bill so that it appears in a position of primacy to the more familiar symbol of the American eagle. He rearranged the order of the two symbols so that, because in English we read from left to right, he reversed the order of the images so that the reverse of the Great Seal, the eye and pyramid, appears on the left, which is the place your eye naturally goes to, because that's how we were taught to read. So that he wanted the eye and the pyramid to be in a position of absolute primacy on the back of the bill. And today, on late night radio and on the internet, people have all these fearsome associations with the phrase New Order. It's a phrase of great beauty. It's a phrase of great idealism. It's a phrase that was put on the back of the dollar bill to remind us of the ideals that aroused a Prince Hall, of the ideals that aroused female mediums who said, I don't need anybody to give me permission to be in touch with the unseen world and to participate in the seen world. There has been this invisible current of occult experience that has served as almost this liberatory, electrifying lightning that's cut across American history, that has been as radical an element in our public lives as was Eve making the self-possessed decision to take a bite of the apple and to share it with Adam, who willingly did the same. And yes, they were, as the telling goes, pushed out of paradise. But they were pushed out of paradise to become real human beings, to stand erect, to have purpose, to have a point to their lives, not to be kept poodles in an island of paradise, but to be people who created and who struggled. And it may be that the price of creation, is human friction. But without it, what would we be? What would we be? And that story of the serpent introducing the apple to Eve, I think can be felt in all of these episodes that I'm describing to you now. And it's fair to ask, well, where are these heroes today? Where are they today? I would have to say, and I say this without any sentimentality, that they sit right here. Every one of you is engaged in an inner search, in an esoteric search, in a search for meaning, in a search for self. I tell these stories not because I want to say, weren't these wonderful men and women? Yes, they were. Yes, they were. But I tell them because I want you and I to have a sense of the epic possibilities that exist within you. Because as above, so below. What you are doing in the hidden is going to be seen, is going to manifest in the outer world and in your concrete experience. And I want you to look at the lives of these people. And as I was describing with Frederick Douglass and others, learn from them, learn from them. Learn how the enormity of the inner search, of the esoteric search, of the occult search can make you into a figure so enormous that you reshape the very times that you live in. And thank you all very, very much for being here.